Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to dive into something pretty interesting today.
Definitely.
We're looking at unsupervised representation learning today for sequence data.
Okay.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at this paper called Unsupervised Representation Learning from Sparse Transformation Analysis.
That's good.
Yeah. And this paper is pretty cool because it looks at how a model can learn and predict transformations in these image sequences.
Right.
And it does all that without any explicit supervision.
Yeah, it's tackling a big challenge in machine learning, right? Defining and learning good representations.
Right.
And it builds on some of the classic concepts,
Yeah.
sparsity and statistical independence.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in methods like sparse coding and independent component analysis, right?
Right, yeah.
But then it sort of extends those ideas to temporal data, with ideas from slow feature analysis. So the goal is to learn representations that really capture how these images change over time, the dynamics of it.
Yeah, and so this paper introduces a new framework called Sparse Transformation Analysis, or STA.
Right.
Can you kind of tell me a bit about the core idea behind STA?
Sure, yeah.
And how it uses these earlier principles?
So STA tries to break down the transformations that happen in sequential data into a sparse set of components.
Okay.
And it uses this generative process where an input sequence is encoded into distributions of latent variables.
Okay.
Then those distributions are transformed over time using a probability flow model.
Okay.
And then finally, the transformed latent variables are decoded to predict a future state.
Interesting.
Yeah, and STA really combines these principles of sparse coding and slow feature analysis and approximate equivariance, all without supervision.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so the paper goes into this technique called Helmholtz flow and how it connects to optimal transport.
Right.
Can you break those concepts down for me a little bit?
Sure.
And explain how they fit into this STA framework?
So STA uses something called the Helmholtz decomposition, and this decomposes the probability flow model into curl-free and divergence-free vector fields.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of this as separating, a complex fluid flow into its rotational and translational components.
Okay, so like separating the swirling from the flowing.
Yeah, exactly. And the connection to optimal transport is in that curl-free component.
Okay.
So you can optimize that component to find the most efficient path, just like finding the cheapest way to transport something between 2 points.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and this adds like a physical intuition and efficiency to how we learn representations.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So the paper mentions using spike and slab priors.
Right.
Can you explain what these priors are?
Sure.
And how they're used in STA?
So in STA, they impose a spike and slab prior on the transformation variable.
Okay.
And the spike variable is basically a selector, so it chooses which transformation primitives are active at a given time step.
Okay.
And then the slab variable controls how fast that chosen transformation happens. Yeah, and this mechanism is good at capturing that natural sparsity of transitions in real-world data because things tend to change smoothly with just occasional abrupt shifts.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like the paper really wanted to test STA on a lot of different data sets.
You did.
Can you talk about the data sets they used?
Yeah.
And what metrics they used to see how well the model performed?
So they tested SDA on a bunch of data sets, M&S Shapes 3D, Falker 3D, Isaac 30, S, and Cityscape.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and they chose this variety of data sets to see how well the model worked on different types of visual data, right?
Okay.
Making sure it's robust and generalizable.
Makes sense.
And they mainly used two metrics. Equivariance error and average log likelihood.
Right.
So equivariance error measures how well the model captures the relationship between changes in the input data and the changes in the learned representation.
Right.
And average log likelihood tells us how well the model's learned distribution matches up with the actual data.
So they really put STA through its paces.
Yeah, they did.
Wow. Okay, so what were some of the key results from all these experiments?
Well,
Did STA work as they expected?
the results were pretty impressive, actually.
Okay.
STA achieved state-of-the-art performance in unsupervised approximate equivariance.
Really?
Yeah, it even rivaled some supervised approaches.
Wow.
So this suggests that the way the model is designed, with things like the Helmholtz decomposition and optimal transport, it's really effective for learning good representations without needing labels.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so the paper also highlights some specific things that STA could do that came out of the experiments.
Great.
Can you tell me more about those?
One remarkable finding was that STA could disentangle not only the transformations themselves, but also how fast they were happening.
Okay.
So it could separate different transformations like scaling, rotation, color changes,
Hmm.
and even figure out how fast these were taking place.
So it's not just recognizing that something's changing, but understanding what's changing and how it's changing.
Exactly. And on top of that, STA could switch and combine transformations really smoothly, even with complex combinations.
So it's almost like the model is learning a grammar for how these visual transformations work.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Wow. Okay, so then the paper moves on to looking at how SEA can be used with real-world video data.
Right.
Can you summarize the applications they focused on
Sure.
and what they learned from them?
So they applied STA to two real-world scenarios: analyzing social interactions in mice behavior videos, and then finding meaningful transformations in autonomous driving videos from the Cityscape dataset.
Okay,
They chose these to see how well the model could handle complex real-world data, where transformations are subtle and mixed together and hard to label manually.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the mice behavior analysis,
Right.
they trained STA on raw video footage without any labels about the types of social interactions.
Exactly.
And what happened?
It was amazing, actually.
What
It
did it-
successfully identified and separated different behaviors like investigation attack and mount. Wow.
And its performance was comparable to supervised approaches, which really highlights how powerful STA is at extracting meaningful patterns from complex unlabeled data.
That's incredible.
It is.
Okay, so what about the autonomous driving application?
Yeah.
What did STA find there?
So in that application, they focused on understanding and predicting transformations in the environment from the perspective of a self-driving car.
Okay.
And they trained STA on sequences of segmentation masks, which are simplified representations of the driving scene.
Okay.
They highlight different objects.
Gotcha.
And were those segmentation masks labeled in any way?
They weren't, were they?
No, they weren't.
Wow.
But even without labels, STA successfully separated different transformations important for autonomous driving, like turning left, approaching a car in front, moving away from a car,
Okay.
and even recognizing changes in the road layout, like going from terrain to sidewalk.
Wow. So STA can extract useful information from both biological behavior and these complex driving scenarios. Exactly. And this type of understanding is crucial for developing self-driving systems that are safe and reliable.
So what about limitations?
Right?
I mean, the paper must have found some, right?
Of course, while STA is a big step forward for unsupervised representation learning, we have to recognize its limitations.
Okay.
The authors point out that the model needs carefully chosen priors and architectural designs that are tailored to the specific types of transformations in the data.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. It's not just plug and play.
Oh.
You still need some domain expertise and understanding of the data to use STA effectively.
That makes sense.
And like any deep learning model, STA needs a lot of computational resources, and you have to carefully tune the hyperparameters to get the best performance.
Yeah.
So it's a powerful tool, but you need to know what you're doing to use it well.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the paper also goes into this interesting connection between STA and the concept of symmetry.
It does.
Can you explain that relationship for me?
So the paper shows how STA can be used not just to disentangle transformations, but also to find and use symmetries in the data.
Okay.
And when we're talking about visual data, symmetry means that an object stays the same after certain transformations.
Right, like a perfect circle staying the same after you rotate it.
Exactly. And the key idea here is that STA can learn to connect specific types of transformations with either the curl-free or divergence-free component of the transformation model.
No.
And the transformations that are linked to symmetry are usually captured by that divergence-free component, which represents rotational or periodic movements.
So if the model is mainly using that swirling component,
Right.
it's a hint that the transformation might be a symmetry of the object.
Precisely, and this is interesting because it means that STA can learn about the symmetries in the data without being explicitly told to do so.
Wow, so it's not just about separating transformations, but also about finding these deeper structural properties of the data.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. And understanding these symmetries can be super helpful for tasks like object recognition, image segmentation, even predicting what a system will do in the future.
How so?
Well, for example, in object recognition, if you know that an object looks the same after you rotate it, you can simplify the recognition process.
Okay.
Instead of learning different representations for every possible orientation, the model can use its knowledge of rotational symmetry to recognize the object no matter which way it's facing.
So the model learns to be more efficient by recognizing these symmetries.
Exactly. And it also leads to a more robust and generalizable understanding of the objects or scenes that it's analyzing.
Interesting.
Yeah, this connection between STA and symmetry really helps us understand how the model learns, and it opens up new ways to explore how symmetry plays a role in visual perception, both in machines and maybe even in biological systems.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of this paper.
We have.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Definitely.
Yeah, there's so much going on here.
Right. So the paper then kind of moves on to look at how STA can be applied to this real-world video data.
Okay.
Can you summarize those applications for me?
Sure.
And the insights that they got from them?
So they looked at two main applications.
Okay.
One was analyzing social interactions in mice behavior videos.
Okay.
And the other one was finding meaningful transformations in videos from the Cityscape dataset, the autonomous driving dataset.
Got it.
They chose these applications specifically because they wanted to see how the model would work with really complex data.
Yeah.
Where those transformations can be really subtle and intertwined, and even hard to label manually.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with that mice behavior analysis.
Right.
So they trained STA on just this raw video footage with no labels at all about what kind of social interactions were happening.
Exactly.
And what did they find?
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
STA was able to successfully identify and disentangle different behaviors in the mice.
Yeah, like investigation, attack, and mount.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that STA performed almost as well as some of the supervised approaches.
Wow.
So this really shows that STA is powerful enough to extract meaningful information from complex data, even when it's not labeled.
Yeah, that's really impressive.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so how about the autonomous driving application?
Yeah.
What insights did they get from that?
So for the autonomous driving application, they wanted to understand and predict those transformations in the environment, but from the perspective of the self-driving car.
Okay.
So they trained STA on sequences of segmentation masks, which are kind of like simplified representations of what the car sees.
Got it.
And these masks highlight the different objects in the scene.
So were these masks labeled in any way?
No, not at all.
Wow, and it still worked?
Yeah, STA was still able to disentangle different transformations that are important for like turning left, approaching a car, and front moving away from a car. And even changes in the road layout, like going from like a dirt road to a sidewalk.
Wow, so STA can find meaning in both biological behavior and these complex driving situations.
Right, and this is really important for building autonomous driving systems that are safe and reliable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so with all of this success, I mean, there have to be some limitations, right?
Of course.
The paper must mention some.
Yeah, so while STA represents this really big step forward for unsupervised representation learning, we do have to acknowledge the limitations.
Okay, what are some of those?
So the authors point out that the model relies on choosing the right priors and designing the architecture in a way that's specific to the types of transformations in the data.
So it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. It's not just plug and play.
Correct.
You need some domain expertise, and you need to understand the data to really use STA effectively.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and like other deep learning models, it requires a lot of computation. You have to be really careful about tuning those hyperparameters. So it's a powerful tool, but you have to know how to use it.
So the paper also delves into this fascinating connection between STA and the concept of symmetry.
Right.
Can you unpack that for me a little bit?
Sure. So the paper explores how you can use STA not only for disentangling those transformations, but also for identifying and using symmetries in the data.
Okay, and just to be clear, what do we mean by symmetry in this context?
So when we talk about visual data, symmetry means that an object's appearance stays the same even after it undergoes certain transformations.
Right, like a perfect circle staying the same after you rotate it.
Exactly. And the key idea here is that STA can learn to connect certain types of transformations with either the curl-free or the divergence-free component of that transformation model.
Oh.
And typically the transformations that are associated with symmetry, those are captured by that divergence-free component, which represents rotational or periodic movements.
Okay, so if the model represents a transformation primarily using that swirling component,
right,
it's a sign that this transformation might be a symmetry of the object.
Exactly. And this is really interesting because it means that STA can learn about these symmetries in the data without having to be explicitly told to look for them.
Wow. So it's not just about separating transformations, but also about discovering these underlying structural properties.
Precisely.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. And understanding these symmetries can be really useful for a lot of different tasks.
Yeah.
such
Wow.
as object recognition, image segmentation, even predicting future states of a system.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So in object recognition, if we know that an object looks the same after you rotate it, we can actually simplify how we recognize that object.
Okay.
So instead of needing to learn separate representations for every possible orientation,
Yeah.
the model can leverage its knowledge of that rotational symmetry to recognize the object no matter how it's oriented.
So the model becomes more efficient by recognizing these symmetries.
Exactly. And it also means that the model's understanding of the objects or scenes it's analyzing is more robust and more general.
Mm.
Yeah, and this connection between STA and symmetry, it really gives us a deeper understanding of how this model learns. And it opens up new possibilities for understanding how symmetry plays a role in visual perception, both in machines and maybe even in biological systems.
This is really fascinating stuff.
It is.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here,
Right.
it's worth talking about the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the implications of this research.
I think this paper offers more than just a new method for unsupervised representation learning.
Yeah.
It's a new way to think about transformations and how they shape how we see the world,
Okay.
both in machines and in biological systems.
Yeah.
And the fact that the model can learn and use symmetries without being told to,
Yeah.
it suggests a deeper connection between how machines learn and how our own minds work.
It's almost like we're using AI to look into our own brains.
Yeah, in a way.
So this deep dive into unsupervised representation, learning from sparse transformation analysis, has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
What are some key takeaways that you'd like our listeners to consider?
So I think STA really challenges us to rethink what a good representation means in machine learning.
Okay.
It's not just about finding disentangled factors anymore.
Yeah.
It's about capturing how those transformations work together over time.
It's about the whole dance, not just
Yeah.
the individual steps.
Exactly. And STA also shows how important it is to use ideas from different fields,
Yeah.
like physics and signal processing, to develop better learning algorithms.
Like the Helmholtz decomposition and optimal transport.
Exactly.
Those are great examples.
Yeah. And lastly, I think STA encourages us to explore what these models mean for understanding our own intelligence.
That's a big one.
It is, by studying how machines learn to see, we might actually uncover some of the fundamental principles behind human cognition.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
It is?
Well, this has been a really insightful exploration.
It has.
It's exciting to see how quickly the field of unsupervised representation learning is moving forward. I can't wait to see what discoveries come next.
Me too.
So thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
I think this research is a big step forward.
Yeah,
And its impact is going to be felt in many different areas.
absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into unsupervised representation, learning from sparse transformation analysis.
Yes, thank you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.